You think you know Nashville. Neon spilling onto Broadway. Steel guitars bleeding out of every open door. Cowboy boots that have never touched dirt, and a party rolling past on the back of a tractor that somebody turned into a moving bar. You hear this city before you ever see it. A dozen bands, in a dozen open-fronted honky-tonks, all playing at once, none of them in the same key, and somehow the whole street holds together like one enormous, happy argument that never ends. Beer and fried batter and somebody's perfume, all of it hanging in the warm night air. Above you, neon guitars and neon boots buzz and flicker, 3 stories tall. That Nashville is real. Stand on Lower Broadway on a Friday night and it grabs you by the collar and dares you to look away. But here is the thing almost no one tells you. That strip of light is the smallest, loudest, most rehearsed corner of a city that has been hiding its real self in plain sight for more than 200 years. Walk 3 blocks off Broadway, the noise drops behind you like a door closing, the crowds thin, and the questions begin. Why is there a full Greek temple glowing on a hill just west of downtown? Why does the spiciest fried chicken in America trace back to a scorned woman and a Sunday morning grudge? Why might the very name Music City come not from country music at all, but from a group of formerly enslaved students who sang for a queen? And why did one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived learn to play here, on a street most visitors never find, a street this city once tried to erase? This is the Nashville the postcard skip, and once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. So leave the neon behind for a moment. The real story does not start on a stage. It starts at the water. Because before Nashville was Music City, it was a river town. In the cold winter of 1779, a man named James Robertson led a small party overland through the freezing dark, and a second group, led by John Donelson, came the long way by flatboat down the Cumberland River, fighting ice and current the whole way. They met on a low limestone bluff on the west bank and threw together a cluster of log cabins they called Fort Nashboro. That bluff is still there. You can stand on it today, downtown, with glass towers at your back and the wide brown river sliding past below, and it is almost impossible to picture how dark and how silent and how far from everything this place once was. The river is the only reason the city exists at all. Boats came first, then the railroads, and a lonely frontier fort grew into a capital. By 1843, Nashville was the permanent seat of the state of Tennessee. By the time the steamboats were running thick at the wharf, it had become a center of trade and money and ambition, sitting in the middle of the South like a crossroads that everything had to pass through. Cotton and whiskey and iron moved along these docks. Fortunes were made on the brown water. And the city grew outward from that single bluff in rings, each generation building over the last, which is why even now you can turn a corner downtown and find a cast-iron Victorian storefront standing in the shadow of a glass tower, the old city and the new one pressed right up against each other. Stand by the Cumberland at dawn, before the bars open, before the tour boats start their engines, and you can feel the older city underneath the new one, mist rising off the water in slow ribbons. The smell of river mud and wet stone and diesel, a heron lifting off the far bank with that prehistoric, unhurried wingbeat. The sky goes gray, then pink, then gold, and the office towers catch fire one window at a time. One strange building downtown lights up in a way the others do not. Locals call it the Batman Building, because its twin spires look like a pointed mask against the sky. But that nickname is the easy joke. The real surprise in Nashville's skyline is not made of glass at all. It is made of marble, and it is hiding in a park. If you stay with me, I will take you to it. Subscribe to Unseen Countries, because in the next few minutes we are going to walk into a full-scale ancient Greek temple, in the middle of Tennessee, and I promise you it is even stranger than it sounds. Head west, away from the river, past the universities, into a green spread of lawns and old shade trees called Centennial Park, families on blankets, a duck pond catching the sun, and then you stop walking, because what is in front of you does not make sense. Rising out of the grass is the Parthenon. Not a model. Not a sculpture in a museum case. The Parthenon. Columns as thick as old oak trunks, dozens of them, marching down each side. A roofline you have seen in 100 photographs of Athens, except those photographs always show a ruin, half its stone blown away, open to the weather and the centuries. This one is whole. This one stands exactly as the original looked nearly 2,500 years ago, before time and war and a gunpowder explosion tore it apart. The story of how it got here is the first key to the real Nashville. In 1897, the state threw an enormous party for its 100th birthday, and the city decided to build a temporary replica of what many believed was the most perfect building in the ancient world. Why the Parthenon, of all things? Because for decades, Nashville had called itself something most people today have completely forgotten. Not Music City, the Athens of the South. Long before the steel guitars, this was a city obsessed with learning, colleges, academies, medical schools, publishing houses, one of the densest clusters of higher education anywhere in the region. A place where young people came to be educated, the way the youth of the ancient world were sent to Athens. The Parthenon was the proof, built of plaster and meant to stand for a single season and then come down. But the people of Nashville loved it too much to let it go. So they rebuilt it, this time to last, in concrete and stone. And then they did something even bolder. They put the goddess back inside. Step through the bronze doors, out of the thick Tennessee heat and into the cool, dim, echoing hall, and you look up, and your breath stops. Standing 42 feet tall, gold from her sandals to the crest of her helmet, is Athena. A sculptor from Nashville named Alan LeQuire spent the better part of a decade building her, finishing in 1990, and later she was gilded so that more than 8 pounds of real gold leaf catch the low light. She is said to be the tallest indoor statue in the entire Western Hemisphere. In her open right hand stands a second figure, Nike, the goddess of victory, and even that smaller figure is taller than a grown man. People walk in chattering, and they go silent. Some of them, the museum guides will tell you, swear out loud. Here is the part that makes you want to grab the arm of the stranger next to you. The ancient Greeks who built the original Athena could only glimpse her on rare, sacred occasions, deep inside the temple. You can walk right up to her, today, in a park in Tennessee, and see her the way almost no living person ever saw the original. And there is one more detail that quietly rewrites everything you thought you knew. The Parthenon was not white. We picture Greek temples as pure, bare marble, but the originals, and this faithful copy, were painted in loud, bright colors. That serene white image of the classical world is, in a sense, a historical accident. Nashville's Parthenon shows it the way it truly was, gaudy and alive. Even the casts of the great marble figures along the pediments are exact copies. The originals sit in a museum in London, an ocean away. Downstairs, in the cool lower galleries, the building quietly moonlights as the city's art museum, hung with American paintings, so that schoolchildren on a field trip can wander from a 4-story golden goddess into a room of soft landscapes without so much as blinking. The way only a child can accept something genuinely impossible that is standing right in front of them. So the country capital was an education capital first. This was always a place that wanted to be taken seriously, a city with something to prove, and that restless ambition kept dragging Nashville into the very center of American history. Walk to the far side of Centennial Park, in the long shadow of that Greek temple, and you find another monument made by the very same hands that sculpted Athena, the Nashville artist Alan LeQuire. 5 women cast in bronze, caught mid-stride. They stand there because of what happened a short walk away, in the summer of 1920, when this city decided the future of half the country. The fight to win American women the vote had come down, after 70 long years, to a single state. 35 had ratified the amendment. One more was needed for it to become law, and Tennessee was the last hope left. So both sides poured into Nashville. Suffragists and their opponents packed the hotels and crowded the marble halls of the state capitol, each side wearing a rose to mark its loyalty, yellow for the vote, red against it, until the whole city bloomed with the colors of a war fought with flowers. Inside the Capitol, the count was deadlocked, tied twice, 48-48, and in the end it came down to the youngest man in the entire legislature, a 24-year-old named Harry Byrne, who sat in his seat wearing a red rose, fully expected to vote no. But folded in his pocket was a letter, 7 pages of small-town news from his widowed mother, Feb, and tucked near the very end, a single quiet instruction. Vote for suffrage, she had written. Don't keep them in doubt, don't forget to be a good boy. When the clerk called his name, to the shock of everyone in the chamber, he said aye. And with that one word, in that building on the hill, a 70-year struggle was over. Women across the entire United States had won the right to vote, and it was sealed right here. Asked afterward why he had done it, Harry Byrne answered simply. A mother's advice, he said, is always safest for her boy to follow. Education. A battlefield. A turning point for the whole nation. And yet the deepest layer of all, the one that may have handed this city its very name, lies further back still. In the years the country tore itself in two, Nashville was a prize. Its river, its railroads, and its factories made it one of the most strategically valuable cities in the South, and early in the Civil War it became the first Confederate state capital to fall to the Union. For the rest of the war it was held under occupation, ringed with earthworks. The grand stone capitol up on its hill turned into an armed fortress. And that occupation changed everything that came after. A Union-held city in the very heart of the South became a beacon. Thousands of people escaping slavery made their way toward Nashville and the protection of those lines, and a new community took root on the northern edge of downtown. When the war finally ended, that community did not scatter. It built. Churches rose. Businesses opened their doors. And almost at once, schools were founded to teach the reading and writing that slavery had made a crime to learn. One of them rose inside the abandoned barracks of an old army hospital, a university for the formerly enslaved. They named it Fisk. On the Fisk campus stands a tall Victorian building called Jubilee Hall, one of the oldest structures on the grounds, and there is a powerful reason it carries that name. Within a few years of opening, the school was broke, sinking under debt, weeks away from closing its doors for good. In 1871, the university's treasurer and music teacher, a man named George White, made a desperate gamble. He gathered 9 students, most of them born into slavery, into a small choir, borrowed money against the school's last hopes, and took them out on the road to sing for the survival of their college. At first they sang the polite, popular music of the day, and audiences barely noticed. Then they began to sing the songs they had carried out of slavery, the spirituals. And something changed in every room they entered. They called themselves the Jubilee Singers. They sang their way north, then across the ocean to Europe, and the response was overwhelming. Crowds wept. They sang for presidents. They sang, as the story is told, for Queen Victoria herself, and the legend that has come down through Nashville says the Queen declared that voices like that could only come from a city of music. Whether or not those were her exact words, what is documented is remarkable enough on its own. The Queen was so moved that she commissioned a full, floor-to-ceiling portrait of the singers as a gift to their school. That portrait still hangs in Jubilee Hall today. They came home having saved the university and raised a fortune, enough to build that first permanent hall with their own voices. Jubilee Hall, paid for entirely in spirituals, still stands today as a national landmark, and a new generation of Fisk Jubilee singers still performs, carrying those same songs into the present. An unbroken thread, stretching all the way back to the students who refused to let their school die. And here is the revelation that should reframe this entire city for you. The nickname Music City may not come from a radio announcer in the 1920s at all. By many accounts it reaches back to those students, decades earlier, taking the music of the enslaved and carrying it across the world. The most country city on earth may owe its very name to black spirituals sung to save a school. Think about that the next time you see Nashville on a postcard. Now, with that secret in your pocket, let us finally talk about the music everyone came for. But not the way the bachelorette buses talk about it. The honky-tonks on Broadway are the storefront. The engine is somewhere else entirely. For most of a century, the real machinery of country music ran along a few quiet blocks south of downtown, in a district of converted houses and low brick buildings called Music Row. Behind those ordinary front doors are the recording studios, the publishers, and the small carpeted writing rooms where the songs you have hummed your whole life were actually born. There is one studio down there that looks like nothing at all, a plain brick box you would walk straight past without a second glance. Inside it, more famous recordings were made than almost anywhere else in America. They built it in 1957, and it became known as the birthplace of the Nashville sound, that smooth, string-soaked style that carried country music out of the backwoods and onto the world's radios. Elvis Presley alone recorded more than 200 songs in this one small room, often warming up on the same battered grand piano that still stands there today, the fingerwear of 1,000 late-night sessions worn right into its keys. And it was here that the players refined a kind of secret language they still use, the Nashville number system, where a song is written down not as notes but as a string of numbers. It means a room full of musicians who have never met can sit down, glance at a scrap of paper covered in figures, and cut a finished hit in a single take, able to change the whole key on the fly with a nod. The effortless polish you hear on the radio is built on that quiet, almost mathematical magic. And the reason all of it pooled here goes back, like everything in this city, to a single moment with a microphone. In 1892, a rough riverboat captain who had found religion built a great brick tabernacle downtown. It was the largest auditorium of its kind in the South, and its acoustics turned out to be so extraordinary that musicians began to call it the Mother Church, the Ryman. Then, in 1925, a local radio station launched a live barn dance that would become the Grand Ole Opry, the longest-running radio show in America, still broadcasting more than 100 years later. Week after week, that signal carried fiddles and steel guitars out across the dark countryside, into farmhouses and kitchens hundreds of miles away. And a nickname that had been waiting since the days of the Jubilee singers finally stuck for good: Music City. The Opry eventually outgrew that little radio studio, and in time it outgrew the Ryman itself, moving to a brand new hall on the edge of town. But they did not leave the old church behind entirely. When they built the new stage, they cut a dark circle of oak out of the floor of the Ryman and set it into the very center of the new one. So tonight, when a singer steps up to the microphone at the Grand Ole Opry, they are standing, quite literally, on the same worn wood where the giants of country music once stood. The ground itself is an heirloom. Step inside the Ryman when it is empty, light pours through tall arched windows of stained glass. The seats are not seats at all. They are church pews, worn smooth and dark by more than a century of people leaning forward to listen. And when a single human voice rises in that room, with no microphone, no amplifier, nothing, it fills every corner so cleanly and so warmly that you understand instantly, in your own chest, why the greatest singers in the world have broken down weeping on that stage. The sound does not bounce off the walls. It blooms, like something opening. If that gave you chills, do me one small thing. Tap the like button. It is the simplest signal I have that tells me to keep hunting for cities with a sound like this one buried inside them. But the most Nashville music moment of all does not happen at the Ryman, or on Broadway, it happens in a strip mall. Out in a quiet shopping plaza, between a dry cleaner and a sandwich shop, there is a tiny room that seats barely 100 people. The Bluebird Cafe. And the rule inside is silence. When the songwriters play, you do not talk. You do not clink your glass. Phones go dark. 4 writers sit in a circle in the middle of the room, knees almost touching the front tables, and they pass a song around, one to the next, trading the verses they wrote alone at kitchen tables, and never expected anyone to hear. This is where Nashville keeps its actual heart. Not the famous faces. The unknown ones, the hired pens behind 100 hits, singing the raw version of a song, before the world ever gets the polished one. In a city built to shout, the truest room is the one where everyone agrees to be quiet. Because for all its neon, Nashville is, underneath everything, a songwriter's town. For every famous face you would recognize, there are 1,000 you never will. People who came here from everywhere with a guitar and a spiral notebook and a stubborn belief that the next song is the one that changes their life. Most of them will never be famous. All of them are the reason this city sounds the way it does. Now, you have been walking all day. You are starving. And in Nashville, getting hungry is exactly how you stumble onto the next secret. Because the most famous thing to eat in this city was born out of revenge. The story goes back to the 1930s, to a man named Thornton Prince. By every account that survives, Prince was handsome, charming, and a serious problem for the women who loved him, because he had a habit of staying out all night long. One of those women finally decided she had had enough. The next morning, instead of confronting him, she cooked him breakfast. Fried chicken. And into that chicken she worked every fierce, burning spice in the kitchen, a punishing wall of cayenne pepper meant to set his mouth on fire and teach him a lesson he would never, ever forget. It backfired completely. He loved it. He loved it so much that he and his brothers reverse-engineered the recipe and opened a little shack to sell it, and Nashville hot chicken was born. The exact dates are blurry, somewhere in the 1930s or 40s, and even the family will tell you the revenge story is impossible to fully verify. But a Nashville historian named Rachel Louise Martin took it seriously enough to spend years researching the dish for a book about its history, and what is beyond any doubt is where it comes from, and what it does to you. What it does to you is this. The crust is thin and lacquered a deep, dangerous red, almost black at the blistered edges. It arrives sitting on 2 slices of plain white bread, with a few pickle chips pinned on top, and the bread and the pickle are not decoration, they are mercy. The first bite is just crunch and salt and a flood of savory heat. The second bite is when the cayenne finds you. Your lips begin to tingle, then to glow. Your eyes water. You reach for the sweet tea and it does absolutely nothing, because this fire is built on oil and oil laughs at water. And you take a third bite anyway, because underneath the burn the meat is impossibly juicy and tender, and your whole body has gone electric and wide awake, sweat on your forehead, heart pounding. Grinning like a fool. People stand in line for an hour for this feeling. They drive across the state for it. A dish invented to be a punishment has become the thing this city is proudest to put in front of you, and it refused to stay a secret. From that single shack it crept across the city, then across the whole country, until you could find a pale, mass-produced echo of it in fast food chains on the far side of the planet. There is a festival devoted to it now, every summer, where cooks battle for the crown and crowds stand sweating in line for plates grated from a gentle warmth all the way up to a heat so punishing that the top tier comes with a warning and a knowing smile from the cook. But the original shack still stands, still run by the founder's own family, still frying it the way that furious, heartbroken woman did almost a century ago. And here is the detail that turns a funny food story into the real map of Nashville. That first hot chicken shack did not open on Broadway, or anywhere near Music Row, or anywhere a visitor would ever have wandered. It opened on Jefferson Street. Which brings us, at last, to the layer this city kept quiet for a very long time. Cross under the interstate to the north side of downtown, and you reach a long avenue called Jefferson Street. Today, much of it is calm, ordinary, a little weathered. You could drive its full length and feel as though you had passed through nothing at all, but stand still here for a moment, and listen for what this street used to be. For most of a century, Jefferson Street was the beating heart of Black Nashville, anchored by Fisk and the other historically black colleges nearby, and it was one of the great music streets in the whole American South. This was a complete and self-contained world. There were banks, grocery stores, clothing shops, ice cream parlors, flower shops, doctors, churches. Everything a community could need, all on one street, built and owned and run by people who had been locked out of nearly everywhere else. By day it hummed with ordinary life. Students filled the sidewalks between classes. The smell of barbecue smoke and fish frying drifted out of corner kitchens. A barber held court through an open door, a radio played somewhere overhead, a church choir worked through a hymn behind a screened window. This was a place where a black family in the segregated South could live a whole, proud, self-determined life, and never once have to ask anyone's permission. And when the sun went down, the clubs lit up. The Del Morocco, Club Baron, the New Era, the Club Stealaway. This was a major stop on what was called the Chitlin Circuit, the proud network of venues across the country where black performers were welcomed and celebrated in the long decades when so many other stages in America were closed to them by law. And the names who lit up these rooms will stop you where you stand. Little Richard, Etta James, Ray Charles, Otis Redding, Jackie Wilson. The world thought of Nashville as the country capital, while at the very same time, a mile away, it was a roaring furnace of jazz and blues and rhythm and soul. Two musical cities, side by side, a world apart. And yet the line between them was never as clean as the map made it look. Musicians moved between the two worlds, and the raw grit of these clubs seeped, quietly, into the polished sound being recorded across town. So while you stand on this quiet block, I want you to answer me something, and tell me down in the comments. Of all the Nashvilles we have walked through so far, the neon stage on Broadway, the golden goddess in her painted temple, the hall where 9 students sang their school back to life. This street that once held an entire universe inside it, which one would you most want to step into on its best night? I read every single reply. Because the most astonishing name to walk Jefferson Street had not become a legend yet when he arrived. In the early 1960s, a young, unknown soldier was stationed at an army base just over the Kentucky line. On his weekend passes, he came down to Nashville, to Jefferson Street, carrying an electric guitar. His name was Jimi Hendrix. Before London, before Woodstock, before he became the man who would tear up every rulebook about what an electric guitar could even be, Hendrix lived in a small apartment above a beauty parlor on this street, alongside his friend and bandmate Billy Cox. And he played these clubs night after night for almost no money at all, learning. By the account passed down here, he found Nashville to be one of the hardest, most demanding audiences anywhere in the South. He said something close to this. Everybody here knows how to play. You walk down the street and people are sitting out on their porches, playing guitar. That, he reportedly said, is where he really learned to play. Sit with that for a second. The sound that would shake the entire world a few years later was sharpened right here, on a porch in North Nashville, in front of the toughest crowd he would ever face. On the wall of the old Club Baron, there is a mural of a guitar duel, the young Hendrix going head-to-head with a revered local master named Johnny Jones. The kind of all-night battle of skill these clubs were famous for. The student who would one day outgrow every teacher on the planet, getting schooled, on Jefferson Street. And here is the quiet irony at the center of it. The Nashville the world was busy celebrating, the polished hits, the smooth strings, the radio gloss, was being recorded a mile south on Music Row. The Nashville that actually handed the future of the electric guitar its education was right here, on a dark porch after midnight, where nobody ever thought to point a camera. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, the street was broken in half. When the interstate highway was routed through Nashville, its path was driven straight through the center of this thriving black district. By some accounts, more than 1,000 residents were displaced from their homes. Businesses that had survived against impossible odds, for generations, were simply gone. The clubs went dark. A street that had built an entire self-sufficient world, and handed a young Jimi Hendrix his education, was cut in two by a wall of concrete, and the music scene that had blazed there for decades was very nearly erased from the city's memory. Very nearly. But not completely. And the reason it survived comes down to one man. There is a small museum on Jefferson Street today, run out of a private home, and it exists for one reason. A lifelong resident of this neighborhood named Lorenzo Washington refused to let the story disappear. For years he has gathered it by hand, the photographs, the old records, the faded concert posters, the maps, the proof that all of it was real, that this quiet street was once a capital of American sound. Step into his rooms and the walls are covered, floor to ceiling, with faces. He can point to a single photograph and tell you which club it was taken inside, and that club is a parking lot now, and the man in the picture went on to change music forever, and almost no one driving past on the street outside has the faintest idea. He does it for almost nothing, out of his own pocket and his own memory, because he was there. He remembers when these blocks were full. He can tell you which corner held which club, what they served, who played, and what it sounded like spilling out into the warm summer night. Every photograph he saves is a small, stubborn act of defiance against forgetting. This is the true heart of Nashville, and it took us the entire journey to reach it. Not the neon. Not even the golden goddess in the park. It is one man, in a small house, keeping a light burning for a world the city paved over, so that anyone who comes looking will discover it was never truly lost, it was carried, by hand, by someone who was there to remember. Stand in that room and the whole city quietly rearranges itself behind you. The hot chicken you ate was born a few doors down. The very name Music City may have started with students from the college up the road. The energy that powers the famous strip drew, in part, from streets exactly like this one. The sound the whole world calls Nashville is older and deeper and far more tangled than the postcard ever admitted, and that is not a sad thing to learn. It is a richer thing. The music here was simply too strong to die. When the walls came down, it did not vanish, it went looking for new rooms. So come back up into the daylight, and look at the living city now, with these new eyes. Cross the river to East Nashville, where the old wooden houses have filled with coffee roasters and record shops and tiny restaurants run by people chasing a dream, where a songwriter you have never heard of is bent over a notebook in a back booth right now, chewing a pencil. Wander into Germantown, the city's oldest neighborhood, red brick and narrow streets, and sit down to a meat and three, the great daily tradition of Tennessee. You point at a steam table. 1 meat. 3 vegetables. Fried okra, turnip greens gone smoky and soft, mac and cheese, a wedge of cornbread still hot enough to melt the butter. The woman behind the counter has been cooking this exact food her whole life, and so did her mother, and a stranger at the next table starts telling you a story you never asked for and somehow cannot stop listening to. Almost no one you meet here is actually from here. The city is booming now, cranes swinging over downtown, new arrivals pouring in every single day. Drawn by the very same thing that once drew Hendrix and the Jubilee singers and a heartbroken cook with a skillet full of cayenne. They came chasing something. Nashville has always been a place you come to in order to become. Slip downtown after dark into Printer's Alley, a narrow cobblestone lane tucked between the buildings, where in the city's wilder years the print shops of the daytime gave way to speakeasies and smoky supper clubs by night, and the music never really stopped. Or stand in the gulch as the sun goes down, glass towers tossing the last gold light back and forth between them, a whole district that was rusting rail yards a generation ago and now gleams. The city keeps doing this. Shedding one skin, growing the next, never quite burying what came before. Come in spring and the whole place softens, dogwoods and redbuds throwing pink and white across the low green hills, the air turning sweet and easy. But the season that truly belongs to Nashville is the summer. Feel the summer here. The humidity wraps around you the instant you step out of the air conditioning, thick and green and almost liquid, carrying the smell of fried food and cut grass and asphalt that has been baking in the sun all day. Cicadas saw away in the trees, a thick wall of sound you stop hearing until the moment it stops. A screen door slaps shut somewhere down the block. By evening it loosens its grip, the light goes long and amber, the first fireflies lift out of the grass like sparks, and the porches start to fill. And somewhere down the block, exactly as it was on the night Jimi Hendrix first walked these streets, somebody is sitting outside in the warm dark with a guitar across their knees, working something out, playing for no one and for everyone. And on Sunday morning, in the black churches of North Nashville, you can still hear the oldest sound in this whole story, the spirituals. The very songs those 9 students once carried out of bondage and across an ocean to save their school, rising again from a choir in robes, more than 150 years on, shaking the rafters. Hands lifted, the whole room rocking as one body. An organ swells, a tambourine catches the beat, and one voice climbs up over all of it until the hair stands up on your arms. The music that may have named this city never once left it, it just kept singing. That, in the end, is the secret of Nashville. The music was never only up on the stage. It is in the kitchens and the churches and the college rehearsal halls, and the porches and the small back rooms where someone is keeping a memory alive. The neon on Broadway is simply the part that learned how to shout. So go back now, one last time, to where we began. Stand on Lower Broadway at night, inside the wash of all that light and all that beautiful noise, the dozen bands and the rolling bars and the cowboy boots that have never once touched dirt. It will still grab you by the collar. It is supposed to. But it cannot fool you anymore, because now you know exactly what is humming underneath it. A river fort that dreamed of being Athens. A goddess of gold in a painted temple. A young man with a red rose and a letter from his mother that handed half a nation the vote. 9 students who sang a dying school back to life and may have named the whole city. A plate of fire born from a broken heart. And a street to the north where the real sound was forged. And broken. And saved. By hand. Some cities perform for you. Nashville waits to see whether you will look past the stage. So here is the thought I will leave you with. Every great city has a version it sells you, and a version it actually is. You have just walked through both of Nashville's. The only question left is which one you would go searching for. The strip that shouts, or the street that remembers. Sit with that one for a while. If this walk through the real Nashville moved something in you, subscribe, and hit the bell, and stay close. Because there are cities all over this world wearing a postcard over their true face, and one by one, quietly, we are going to lift it. I will see you on Unseen Countries.